there, everybody, and welcome back to the Sagas of Swamp Thing podcast. Today we are reading issue number 15, and just a little catch-up on what's been going on in the last couple issues. A couple issues back, we saw Swamp Thing being saved by Matt Cable, Abby, and Bolt from a government facility. And Matt Cable had come up with a good escape plan where the government would think that Swamp Thing is dead, and there would be no more need for them to try to find him. And then also Matt, Abby, and Bolt were going to help Swamp Thing become Alec Holland again. So the escape went mostly to plan. None of our main characters got hurt, and the government does think that Swamp Thing is dead. And the only thing that went wrong was that Swamp Thing was supposed to meet up with Matt Cable and company once the government closed the books on Swamp Thing's case, but instead Swamp Thing got kind of depressed. He figured, it doesn't matter, they can't help me anyway, so he went off on his own back to the swamps of Louisiana, which is how we got to the last issue where Swamp Thing came upon a child that was kind of mutated, that was being chased by a town mob because he looked different. So of course Swamp Thing is no fan of that, and he helped the children out as much as he could, but in the end the town's hatred ended up killing one of the children, or more accurately, they tried to kill her by setting her home on fire, and unbeknownst to them, the mayor's son was inside of that house waiting for the kids to return, and so the little girl had to save him, and she died in the process. And because of that, it seemed like maybe the town had learned a lesson, possibly, and I guess that was good enough for Swamp Thing because he left her brothers in the care of them. And then he just kind of walked away from the situation. And that is where we left off with the last issue. So first things first with Swamp Thing number 15, and we got the cover. We see a demon bursting through a window, and he has grabbed hold of Swamp Thing's neck, and Swamp Thing is struggling as he falls to the ground, and we see behind them there is a man in preacher clothes that looks like he's doing some sort of magic, like possibly he called the demon forth. And as we turn to the first page, we are in the swamp. There's a lightning storm going on, and all the animals in the swamp are running for cover. And over this panel, the narration says, "Storm lashes the bayou. Great fingers of electrical fire streak from a sun-starved sky, gouging deep into the cowering trees, sending myriad swamp dwellers skittering to ineffective shelters. But for one such swamp creature, the spattering of rain on moss-caked hide is of little consequence, for there are other considerations filling his troubled mind, considerations manifest in his loping, half-stumbling stride, the unmistakable gait of a hunted animal." And like the text says, we do see Swamp Thing walking through the swamp, but he does look like he's kind of running from something. And as he does, he thinks, "Blast that Matt Cable. Why can't he leave well enough alone? Can't he see that I don't want to be found? That I skipped out on our rendezvous in Washington for a reason? No, he's too stubborn. Has to find the answers for himself." And as he's thinking this, he's walking from the tree line into an open area, and the narration says, "Lost in thought, the hulking monstrosity shambles into a clearing, into one of the infrequent hillocks that dot the primeval bog, an action that will soon prove most unwise." Then we turn the page and we get a full-page splash of Swamp Thing getting hit by lightning, and the narration says, "Fact. Lightning is the rapid, searing discharge of electrons between the earth and the sky. Fact. Said lightning invariably chooses the highest point in a given area as its target. Fact. The 7-foot-plus bulk of unwary Swamp Thing has just unwittingly become the highest point in this particular area. Conclusion? Inevitable." And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is The Soul Spell of Father Bliss. And I don't think I said it at the beginning, but this is written by David Michelini with art by Nestor Redondo. Then we turn the page and we cut to Matt Cable, Bolt, Abby, and Old Man Luke, who we haven't seen for a couple issues. And we see them sitting down on a tree stump, and we do see Bolt has a rifle as well as Luke, and Luke is saying to the group, "Listen, Mr. Cable, I don't mind helping you track down that mossy monster of yourn. I ain't even asking why, but couldn't you have picked a nicer day for looking?" And Matt answers, "Relax, Luke. These rains never last more than a half hour or so, and then," but Matt is cut off by Bolt, who interjects, "That Swamp Thing will be another half hour ahead of us. Well, the rest of you can stand around keeping your jollies dry, but I'm going out after what we came for." And with that, Bolt walks away from the group, and Abby yells out, "Bolt!" But he doesn't pay attention to her, and Matt says to Abby, "Let him go, Abby. You know he's only going to do what he wants, no matter what any of us say." And the narration says, "And as the hot-headed black man plunges into the stormy bog, a dazed and shaky man-brute is slowly grappling his way back to consciousness, only to find. Then we get a panel of Swamp Thing being helped up by a hand that comes out of nowhere. And Swamp Thing, like it said, is dazed and confused, and he's thinking, "Someone helping me. Guess my little snooze gave Cable time to..." But then as he stands and he sees who's helping him up, he says, "What?" Because it's not Matt Cable that's helping him. It is an older gentleman who is wearing preacher's garb. And the preacher is saying to him, "Rest easy, my son. I am Father Jonathan Bliss, and though I know not what manner of being you are one of God's creatures, and you are in need. Come, there are salves and ointments at my church. Perhaps they can ease your discomfort." So Father Bliss puts his arm around Swamp Thing and leads him back to the church, and as he does this, Swamp Thing thinks, "The way I feel, I don't guess I've got much choice." Then we cut to Father Bliss and Swamp Thing arriving at the church, and this building is very dilapidated. The roof is even caving in on one side, and there's a giant hole that looks like the wall's about to collapse on one side as well. And as they approach the building, Father Bliss says, "Here we are, my son. It's not much, but I call it home." And as he leads Swamp Thing into the building, we see a bunch of pews scattered everywhere. And curiously, there is a cross where it should be, except it's upside down. And Father Bliss is motioning to the open room and saying to Swamp Thing, "You'll have to forgive the clutter. I've been having trouble with, vandals lately. Seems that nothing is sacred these days. Now, you just sit back. I'll see to those medicines." And as Swamp Thing sits down on one of the pews and puts his head in his hands like he's still dizzy, we see Father Bliss go through some curtains. But as he does, he's looking back at Swamp Thing, and he looks pretty suspicious. And the narration says, "The old minister's smile is reassuring as he parts the curtain to an adjoining anteroom, and his eyes nigh twinkle with benevolence. Benevolence, and perhaps something else as well. For as the soft rustle of faded velvet seals off the small chamber, then we get a panel of the Father coming through the curtains, and we see a glowing orb in the middle of this second room, and it also looks like it's just floating in midair, and there's something swirling inside of it. And as the Father walks closer to it, he says, "He was there, Nebiros, just as you said, and he's even bigger, even stronger than I imagined. Yes, Dark One, you have chosen well. Our unassuming friend will make a perfect pawn for bringing about the end of the world." Then we turn the page and we cut to Bolt, and he's walking around in the swamps, and the narration says, "Heat fairly seethes from the damp, oppressing air, picking at the remnants of a temper already frayed with frustration." And as Bolt wipes his brow, he says, "Nothing, damn it. Not so much as a slimy footprint. Guess I better check back with the others. Maybe they've come up with something more than mosquito bites." So he says into his walkie-talkie, "Search 2 to Cable. Come in, Kit." But he's cut off as a claw comes out of nowhere and grabs him by the waist, but we do see a shadow of a helicopter on the ground next to him. So he gets pulled away into the sky. Then we come back to Swamp Thing inside the church, and he is now kind of resting on the pew in front of him, and Father Bliss is putting his hand on Swamp Thing's back, and he has brought something for Swamp Thing to drink. And he's saying to Swamp Thing, "There, my boy, how's that?" And Swamp Thing thinks, "Don't know what's in your home remedies, preacher, but I do feel some better." Then Swamp Thing stands, and he thinks, "So I guess I best be on my..." But Father Bliss interrupts his thoughts, asking, "What? Why, you're not leaving, are you? But you can't. I mean, what if that mob of vandals should come back? What would happen then? You see what they did to my church, and I assure you they would treat me no better, even though they were once my own congregation." And it seems that with this last line, Swamp Thing takes pity on what Father Bliss is saying, and he stops to listen as Father Bliss continues. "Oh, they were good people, basically, but their faith was foundering. Perhaps that's why I got the call, for I suddenly knew it was my duty to bring them back into the fold. Only they'd been gone away from God too long, and when I tried to force belief onto their stubborn souls, they jeered at me, called me a fanatic." And then he walks over to the wall where there is an upside-down cross hanging on it, and he begins to touch it as he continues, saying, "What could I do but turn to less conventional means?" And then Father Bliss motions to an area on the ground where it seems like most of the wall that was demolished has fallen onto, and he continues, "But though it was for their own good, the poor misguided children didn't understand, and the result of their ignorance lies here. my workroom, and quite possibly man's last hope for salvation, buried beneath this rubble. And then he looks at Swamp Thing pleadingly and he says, and being rather frail, I just don't know how I'll ever remove it. And Swamp Thing isn't as slow as Father Bliss thinks, because as he's putting on this act and pretending to cough, Swamp Thing thinks, your hints, Father, are about as subtle as a landmine. But still, you helped me once, and the least I can do is return the favor. So Swamp Thing moves a bunch of the rocks and wooden beams off of what looks like a cellar door that leads down into a basement. So as Swamp Thing uncovers it, Father Bliss yells, oh, bless you, my boy. You're most kind. And then he opens the cellar door, and as he walks down the steps, he says, now do come along, won't you? You may be able to, aid me further. And as we turn the page, we see Father Bliss leading Swamp Thing down into what looks like a room filled with occultic paraphernalia and things that, like, a sorcerer would have. There's a big old book that's on a stand that has chains around it and also a lock on it. There's a pedestal that has a pentagram on it, and on each of the points of that pentagram is a candle that has been burned down. And of course, your usual human skulls and stuffed goat heads hanging on the wall. So as they walk into this room, the narration says, the sputter of a dark tallowed candle, and light etches a room best left to shadow. A musky chamber arrayed with trappings more suited to some madman's nightmare than the cellar of an erstwhile house of God. And as they get to the bottom of the steps and enter the room, Father Bliss says to Swamp Thing, good, everything seems in order. I can begin at once. And then he immediately goes over to the wall where some wizard's robes are hanging, and he begins to put them on. And of course, Swamp Thing is just staring at this very awkwardly because, you know, this is supposed to be a priest or a preacher, and he's putting on wizard's robes. And this room looks very satanic. And of course, Father Bliss sees the look on Swamp Thing's face, and he says, ah, but you wonder why a priest would dabble in black magic. Well, my son, I believe that even the pious must bend where the ends justify the means. Then he walks over to the book after he finishes putting on his robes, and he pulls out a key and he unlocks the lock on it, and he continues saying, though I do regret your part in all this, it seems the innocent always suffer the most. Then the narration in this panel says, but before the curious man-brute can ponder the holy man's cryptic words, an ancient book is opened, and an incantation begun. A droning hypnotic chant that dulls the Swamp Thing's senses, so that he doesn't notice the odd glowing orb that wafts down the stairway behind him. So as Father Bliss starts reading from the book, we see he's raising his hands like he's doing some magic, and Swamp Thing is just looking at him dumbfounded, and then behind him we do see the glowing orb coming down the stairs. Then we get 3 panels, and in the first one, Swamp Thing is just staring forward, looking kind of hypnotized. Then in the second one, he notices something behind him. Then in the third one, he notices the orb, but it's too close. And over these panels, the narration says, he doesn't hear the soft hum of anticipation as the globe begins to pulse, doesn't feel the glowing weakness as his very will is sucked greedily from his mind. No, the muck-draped monstrosity is unaware of any of these circumstances until it is too late. The eerie, moaning chant reaches apex, and the throbbing globe fairly shrieks with triumph. And as Swamp Thing turns and sees the globe next to him, he's got a very scared look on his face, and then he freezes, like in the same position he was just in, so his arms are kind of in an awkward position, and his body literally just falls forward in that same position, face first to the ground. And as this happens, the narration continues, saying, as a mind gone empty ceases to function, and a hulking body is soon to follow. But what happens next is quite unpleasant, and so we shield our innocent eyes. And at that ominous narration line, we see Father Bliss is standing next to the orb, and he says to Swamp Thing, I am sorry, my son, but there was no other way. Very well, Nebiros, do what you will. He is yours. Then we turn the page and we cut to the outside of the building, where we see Matt Cable, Abby, and Luke, and they are just coming out of the woods, and they see the church, and of course they're all hot from walking and stuff, and Luke is saying, whew, I'd say I was about ready for a breather. And Abby says to Matt, I think we could all use a rest. And it just so happens that this is the clearing that Swamp Thing came out of, and that's where the church is. And Matt sees the church and he says, okay, there's a clearing of some sort up ahead. We can, hey, an old church. And then surprisingly, we see Swamp Thing walking out of the church, And Matt says, Alec? For the love of sanity, man! We've been looking all over this stinking swamp for you. And then he runs over to Swamp Thing, and he says, why the devil have you been running from us? Don't you realize we just want to... But he stops talking as Swamp Thing turns to him, and there's definitely something wrong. Swamp Thing's eyes are completely white, and usually they're red and they have pupils and stuff, but they don't have any of that now. They're just completely white like he is possessed. And Abby notices it first and says, Matt, wait! There's something wrong! His eyes! But it is too late. Cable is too close to Swamp Thing, and the narration says, but Matt Cable has little time to ponder the strange hollowness in the swamp beast's eyes. In fact, he has little time for anything save pain. And with that, the possessed Swamp Thing backhands Matt Cable in the face and knocks him out. And then he grabs Abby, and Abby yells, why, you're not Alec Holland! And then Luke pulls up his firearm and he says, well, I don't care what you are, fella. You ain't getting them ugly hands on me. And then he immediately begins firing his rifle at Swamp Thing. And of course, as we know from the past, bullets don't do anything to him. They just go straight through his body. And as Luke fires the bullets, he says, no, sir, you ain't gonna... But then he sees they do nothing. And then he's terrified as the swamp monster turns towards him and says, you annoy me, little man. You'll annoy me no longer. So the possessed Swamp Thing, who now has a passed out Abby in his hands, rushes at Luke and punches him in the face, which knocks Luke out as well. And then he drags all of the passed out bodies into the cellar below. And as he does this, the narration says, an arrogant sun glares down accusingly, casting terse shadows as the moss-wet monster bends, grasps, and with a curious unfamiliar stiffness, drags three unmoving forms into the waiting dark of the church. A flicker of time, a cool touch of mildewed air on the heavy-lidded eyes, and then we cut to the cellar where we see Matt Cable, Abby, and Luke are hanging from ropes attached to the ceiling by their hands. And as they come to, Father Bliss sees this and says, ah, my children, I'm glad you are all awake once more. I'm Father Bliss, and I trust you're not too uncomfortable. And besides Father Bliss, what the three are seeing in the room is Swamp Thing staring at the orb as it hovers in front of him, and he's got his hands around it like he's peering inside of this orb. So Matt Cable comes to the most, I guess, and he looks at Father Bliss and says, stuff the small talk, mister. Why have you got us trussed up like this? And what have you done to Alec Holland? And Father Bliss replies, I'm afraid the bonds are, necessary, my son. And as for your friend, I assure you he's quite safe, as you can see. And then he motions to the orb, and inside of it we see the floating human body of Alec Holland. And as Matt sees this, he says, what? Oh my God, Alec! Then the orb begins to move and hover close to Abby and Matt and Luke, and as they stare at it, Father Bliss and the possessed Swamp Thing get big smiles on their faces, and Father Bliss says, oh, you needn't worry. The transcendental globe keeps his essence, his soul, if you will, in perfect stasis. He's not even aware of his condition. You see, the globe is sort of a way station between worlds. It was necessary in summoning forth Nebiros, the demon who now possesses your monstrous friend's body. And then Matt exclaims, possesses? And Father Bliss replies excitedly, oh yes! The Dark Ones can't exist in this dimension without a host body, and since mortal frames are so puny, I'm afraid Nebiros insisted on, borrowing that of your unfortunate Mr. Holland. He was out accustoming himself to its, peculiarities when you three happened along. And then the orb moves away from the three as Father Bliss continues talking, and Abby asks, but why summon a demon, for God's sake? And Father Bliss answers, why, that's precisely it, my dear. For God's sake. You see, man has strayed from the holy path, has chosen instead the ways of sin and corruption. He must be saved from himself, have his faith restored. And then his eyes get all crazy as he continues saying, and when Nebiros has drawn his full power from the netherworld, mankind will be taught that much-needed lesson, for together we shall bring about Armageddon. Yes, Armageddon, the final battle, the ultimate chaos. For with the ultimate chaos loose in the world, the ultimate in order must surely reveal itself to balance the cosmic scales, and the ultimate in order can only be God. Then Father Bliss walks really close to the three that are hanging from the ceiling, and he says to them, "Don't you see? It's so simple. With God manifest once more, people will have to believe." And all three of the prisoners are looking at Father Bliss like he is crazy, but Matt is the first one to speak, saying, "You're mad, Bliss. After that kind of Holocaust, no one will be left alive to believe." And this seems to shake Father Bliss a bit, and he turns to the Nebiros possessed Swamp Thing, and he says, "But Nebiros assured me." But he's cut off as the Nebiros possessed Swamp Thing replies, "I assured you nothing, fool, save the continuance of your trifling existence. For now I am at full strength, and I thirst for the feast of ruin that has been promised me. But perhaps I should first study these mortals. It is good to know one's enemy, and there is still much I have to learn about." And then he walks over to Old Man Luke, who's hanging from the ceiling, and he finishes his thoughts saying, "The human soul." And with that, he reaches inside the chest of Luke and pulls out Luke's soul. And as he does, Luke screams out, "Ah!" And the narration says, "Agony bleeds from the anguished cries that echo through the shadowed chamber, as the hell-driven Swamp Thing peels away the layers of a man's life like the soft skin of some overripe fruit." And as Father Bliss and the other prisoners stare around with terror, Matt Cable yells to Father Bliss, "Is this what you wanted, Bliss? Is this your idea of salvation?" And Bliss replies, I didn't realize, but no. What price are a few souls if they will bring him back to the people?" And Matt replies, "Yeah, but what if it won't, Bliss? What if your theology isn't all it's cracked up to be? What if God isn't some knight in shining armor that's going to drop down from a cloud to save humanity in the final reel?" And this angers Father Bliss, and he yells, "Infidel, you speak blasphemy!" But Cable fires back, "I speak reason. Look at man's history. How can you call all that murder, war, and cruelty God's work? Can't you see that mortality has been left to man? That God wants man to choose between good and evil for himself?" And Father Bliss puts his hands over his ears and he says, I won't listen." But Matt Cable continues saying, "But you have to listen, Bliss, because you're trying to make man's choice for him. Can't you see, you overzealous maniac? You're putting yourself above God." And Father Bliss is in denial, saying, No, you're wrong." And Cable replies, "Maybe I am, Bliss, but with the survival of mankind at stake, can you afford to take the chance that I'm not? Are you willing to take the damnation of an entire world on your own soul, Father Bliss?" And finally, it seems that Matt got through at that last line, and Father Bliss says, I. And I should say that the whole time this conversation between Matt Cable and Father Bliss has been going on, we see the possessed Swamp Thing in the background, and he has been continuously manipulating Luke's soul, and every time he does a movement, it's been getting smaller and smaller until finally it disappears. And then he turns to Father Bliss and Matt Cable and says, "It is done, and I am disappointed. I had hoped the game would provide more sport, but if all mortals are made of such sorry stuff as this." But then the possessed Swamp Thing walks over to Matt Cable and grabs him by the arm and says, "But perhaps a younger specimen might offer more amusement." And Abby, who is hanging right next to Matt Cable, is very frightened by this, and she yells out, "Matt!" But before she can say anything else, and before possessed Swamp Thing can do anything, we hear Father Bliss yell out, "Nebiros, Tophet Elohim!" And possessed Swamp Thing turns and says, Something pulling at me, trying to tear me from this body." And then he exclaims as he sees Father Bliss is the one saying the words, "What? You dare defy me? Whittle at me with your petty spells of exorcism." And we see Father Bliss standing behind him with that book, and he says to Nebiros, I had no right to bring you here in the first place, demon, but perhaps there is still time to send you back." So he begins reading from the book, and a whirlwind starts in the room around possessed Swamp Thing, and the narration over this panel says, "Hurriedly, a voice cracked and shaky with self-doubt completes the purifying incantation, and the cellar room fairly shudders with the clash of powers whose age can only be guessed at in whispers. But in the end..." So we see possessed Swamp Thing struggle for a bit, but then he seems to be okay, even as Father Bliss is continuing the incantation, and Nebiros yells at him, "Your spell was too weak, preacher. You underestimated my power. A mistake you'll not live to rectify." And as he rushes towards Father Bliss to attack him, we get a panel of Abby Arcane, whose eyes all of a sudden become very wide, like she's having a vision or something. And the narration says, "But fate works in mysterious ways. Witness the eyes of one Abigail Arcane as they spring wide, as if focusing on something far beyond normal ken. Something awesome, and perhaps just a bit frightening." And then Abby yells out, "Matthew, the globe!" Now, since the Nebiros-possessed Swamp Thing grabbed at Matt Cable, I guess Cable's ropes were loosened because he is now free, and it looks like he's just been kind of waiting, trying to figure out what to do and what his next move should be. But as Abby yells, "the globe," Matt says, "Huh?" And Abby replies, "You've got to smash the globe! It's the demon's power source! Without it, he can't resist the spell!" So obviously there's something supernatural going on with Abby that just awakened inside of her as this fight began. So Matt Cable begins to go along with what Abby said. He picks up a candlestick to smash the orb, but he does say, "But Alec's soul is in there." But Abby replies, "Trust me, Matt, he'll be unharmed, but there's no time for questions. Just do it, do it, do it." And Matt Cable does just that. He takes a candlestick and he smashes the floating orb in the room. And with that, the possessed Swamp Thing stops in its tracks, and we see a reddish smoke begin to form around him as he doubles over in pain and falls to the ground. And the narration says, "The sound of shattering crystal fades into the moss-damp walls, to be replaced by a low throbbing moan, a painful wail that swells to a shriek as a hell-spawned obscenity is thrust from an unearned form." And then we see the true form of Nebiros in all his hellish glory. He pretty much looks just like your classic demon. His body is completely red. He has goat legs. He also has horns and yellow eyes. And he has wings, so he is flying around the room. And now that he's free of Swamp Thing, he looks around and he says, "So, mortals, you would deny me a body. Very well, then. You shall pay for that insolence. Pay dearly indeed." And then he flies towards Matt and Abby as Matt Cable is trying to untie her. But Swamp Thing reaches out and grabs one of Nebiros' hoofs, and he yells out, "No!" And then he throws Nebiros backwards into the cupboard of occultic books and other occultic paraphernalia. And it shatters, sending everything flying. And the narration over this panel says, "Confusion curls like a vicious fog about the reinstated mind of Dr. Alec Holland. He knows not how his hapless friends have come to join him in this dank and darkling chamber. He knows not the nature of the scabbed and scaly horror that confronts them. He only knows that the one thing that can hope to stand between the two is himself." So as Swamp Thing gets to his feet, and he takes a defensive stance between Nebiros and Matt Cable and Abby, Nebiros recovers and rushes towards Swamp Thing, saying, "Take heed, interloper. That fool preacher's conjurations may have stayed me from inhabiting your body, but no power on earth can keep me from tearing it to minuscule shreds." And with that, Nebiros jumps onto Swamp Thing, and as he grabs Swamp Thing by the shoulders, he begins kicking with his hooved feet into Swamp Thing's sides, tearing really big chunks of muck and moss from them. And as this happens, Swamp Thing thinks, "Lord, he's ripping out chunks of my hide as big as softballs. Got to stop him before I'm nothing but a pile of muck on the floor. Got to get a hold and..." But as Swamp Thing grabs a hold of Nebiros' arm and tries to shake him off, Nebiros' forearm begins to dissipate. And Swamp Thing thinks, "Huh?" And Nebiro yells, "My mass! It's dissipating! The caustic forces of this plane work too swiftly!" And then I guess because Swamp Thing is distracted, Nebiros is able to punch Swamp Thing in the face to get him away from him, and he yells, "Away, monster! I've no time to toy with you. I must take a new host body immediately, else my unrestrained mass disperse throughout your entire universe." And just as he says that, Father Bliss, who I guess at the beginning of this fight was dropped on the ground, gets up and he says, "No, evil one, you'll not harm these innocents. It was I who brought you into this world, and if anyone must suffer for it, let it be me." And Nebiros looks at him and says, "As you wish, holy man." And then Nebiros' body turns into a smoky substance and begins to go into the body of Father Bliss. And the narration says, "Once more the shrill demon scream lances the air. Only this time it's not a cry of pain, but one of triumph. And when the whining dies, And then we get a panel of the possessed Father Bliss, who looks at Matt Cable and Swamp Thing and says, "This body is old, feeble, but appearances of no importance. What matters is power, and my power remains undiminished. Power to shatter souls, sunder worlds, to rule the very..." But he's cut off as all of a sudden he notices the hand of Father Bliss burst into flames, and he exclaims, "Wah! I'm smoldering! This body, it's too frail! It can't contain my mystic energy! My very essence is causing it to burn up from the inside!" And as his body begins to burn from the inside out, it falls to the ground and he says, "And there's no time to take another body. I'm trapped. Damn that Bliss. He knew this would happen. He knew." And as the demon soul burns away, we get some narration that says, "Darting tongues of flame lick outward from the ruined priest's charring flesh, and for the briefest of instants, hollow eyes light with a glow of infinite sadness, and a wisdom too late in the learning." So now that the demon is completely burned away, Father Bliss croaks his last words saying, "Forgive me." And with that, Matt, Abby, and Swamp Thing rush out of the cellar, and in the narration it says, "A low rumble suffuses itself through the ancient masonry, quivering the stone as if the very heavens themselves were angry at losing one of their own." So the entire church begins to shake as Matt Cable and Abby make it up and out of the cellar. And as they do, Matt yells, "Move, before this place comes down around our ears!" And just as they make it out, we see the church collapse into a big pile of rubble, and the narration over this panel says, "And then, with a whisper that might be a sigh, the earth shrugs, the time-worn edifice crumbles, and the legacy of Jonathan Bliss becomes a clutter of rubbled granite and dreams." Then we cut to the three at the edge of the tree line of the swamp, and Abby is sitting down and she says, "Poor Luke, he came along out of friendship, only to end up like..." But Matt interjects and puts his hand on her shoulder saying, "Don't think about it, Abby. What we have to worry about now is getting Alex someplace where we can communicate, so Luke's death won't be in vain." And then Abby stands up and Matt continues saying, "So come on. Bolt should be waiting at the rendezvous point, and by now..." But he's cut off as Swamp Thing begins to point at something in the air, and he says, "Huh? What is it, Alec?" And Swamp Thing thinks, "I don't think anyone's waiting anywhere, Matthew. Look." And then Matt Cable follows Swamp Thing's finger into the sky, where he sees Bolt hanging from a helicopter by a clamp that is around his waist. And the narration says, Matt Cable's questioning eyes follow the moss-draped finger and freeze as they lock on an eerily familiar shape soaring by overhead. And the familiar shape they're talking about here is the helicopter, and that is because it looks exactly like the same helicopter that the Conclave was using earlier in the Len Wein run. But Cable doesn't just notice that, he sees something else, and the narration continues. A shape that dangles an even more familiar, deathly still figure behind it. And Matt Cable exclaims, "Bolt!" And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.